Welcome to Incredible Idaho. I'm Wayne Walker. Our show tonight is a good example of the diversity of habitat and landscape you'll find in our incredible state. In the course of the program this evening, we'll take you from spectacular mountains and canyons to the quiet vastness of the high desert, and then on to the flat expanse of our colorful marshlands. We begin our show in the steep, rugged country of Hell's Canyon, home of the Rocky Mountain Bighorn sheep. Spring is the lambing season, and the high, rocky cliffs offer a safe haven for the ewes and their newborn offspring.
Yeah, there's a ewe there. There were 5 came up through there. Yeah, that draw has just got to be full of sheep.
Wildlife biologist Vic Coggins from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Lloyd Oldenburg from the Idaho Department of Fish and Game are checking up on some old friends.
Well, right now they've dropped from at least a dozen ewes and 16 lambs down to where I can see about 5 or 6. But they've fed around into a big draw there.
For the past 20 years, these two men, like doting parents, have been following the progress of the various bands that make up the bighorn population here. There's a good reason for their unflagging interest. In the mid-'70s, Lloyd and Vic were instrumental in restoring the bighorn sheep to Hell's Canyon. Historically, this country was teeming with wild sheep. Pictographs and petroglyphs portraying the bighorn hunts were etched on the canyon walls by Native Americans throughout the area. The first white settlers wrote in their journals of using wild sheep for food, but at the turn of the century, the influx of thousands of domestic livestock may have triggered the demise of the bighorns by forcing the wild sheep to compete for grazing territory. The bighorn population began crashing, and by the 1930s, wild sheep had become extinct in Hell's Canyon. This beautiful country, perfect habitat for bighorn sheep, lay virtually empty.
Everywhere you look, there's all the things that sheep need for year-round livelihood. They have food, they have escape cover. There's miles and miles and miles of it. Between the two states, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 650,000 acres here in Hell's Canyon.
It's been 2 decades since the first transplants, and still the population hasn't expanded to reach its full potential. But that doesn't mean they aren't reproducing. The big rams are off on their own, but high on the hillside, bands of females travel the ridges followed closely by newborn lambs.
There's vertical rock cliffs where the ewes go to have their lambs, and they raise them for the first 2 or 3 weeks of their life before they venture out very far.
The sheep are amazingly sure-footed in this vertical terrain, but accidents do happen, and sometimes they're fatal. This little guy is determined to shadow his mother no matter how tough the territory.
And it appeared to me his mother went ahead of him, and he tried running up, and he didn't have enough strength to run up, and he fell over backwards, and then he went around and tried to go up, and he fell off sideways, and then he went all the way around, and he made it up the cliff. But I think there is some mortality from that.
Falling is not the only threat to newborn lambs. They are vulnerable targets, often the victims of hungry mountain lions, golden eagles, or coyotes. Now watch this sequence, shot last summer in Hell's Canyon by photographer Bill Burkett. A single coyote has a whole herd of bighorns on the run, but as you can see, it's the 2 smaller lambs that begin to lag behind. Whether or not the lambs escape is not evident, but such dramas are commonplace as wildlife plays out the balance of predator and prey. Despite these factors, the biologists think this year will be a good one for the sheep herds. The rainy weather has restored the parched earth, and the hillsides are covered with nutritious forbs and grasses. Added to that diet are protein blocks containing the drug Ivamac that scientists hope will help to treat a sheep disease called scabies,
which is a mite that can cause, in extreme cases, a lot of hair loss and finally death.
The sheep we're seeing on this trip appear to be free of the disease. In fact, they seem content to simply bask in the sun or stroll along the ridges, putting on a show for those of us watching from below.
I just enjoy watching them, I guess, and spending time with them. The phone never rings out here. Of course, you've got the rams that have large horns, and in a lot of cases, the older ones, and then you've got a lot of activity. They're not like deer and elk, because you're able to see them out doing things right during the middle of the day.
I'm really not sure. I guess everybody looks at this as the ultimate wild, free, big symbol of a big game animal that lives in the mountains. They've been perpetuated over the ages. You know, every writings from way back are bighorn sheep apparently were the #1 prized big game animal. And it hasn't changed a lot with a whole lot of people at this time.
This year's generous water supply has colored not only the steep slopes of Hell's Canyon in vivid shades of green, it's also tinted our desert country. The traditionally dusty Owyhee Desert has come vibrantly alive, blooming in the rich hues of wildflowers and lush prairie grasses. It's difficult to believe that only a year ago this country was in the grip of a severe drought. This summer, the dull brown and gold of the high desert has yielded to the bright greens and soft blues of blooming camas. A spring has pooled into a pond, its reedy edge populated by yellow-headed blackbirds. A pair of shovelers floats the surface, distinguishable by their large spatulate bills. Further out, a coot pokes along, swimming with its peculiar lurching motion. The hillsides are carpeted in green, and in the distance, the mountaintops, still crested with snow, are a promise of more water to come as the weather warms. A ribbon of roadway bordered by bright pink phlox invites us in to explore the stillness of the desert. But be forewarned, the route can be rough, bumpy, and slow, with numerous stops to open and close several tough old ranching gates. But those with the will and the wheels can venture on further to discover the surprise of wonderful fishing holes, perhaps the last thing one would expect to find in the midst of a vast desert. They're old reservoirs with whimsical names like Ed's Defeat or Shoe Fly. Most were built by homesteaders for cattle. In the last 5 years, some of the larger reservoirs have been stocked with a desert trout called the Lahontan cutthroat.
And we're coming down here to kind of see how they're doing, setting several types of fishing gear to sample the lakes. You know, this is kind of just an assessment of it to see if we want to continue or if we need to change anything.
The Idaho Department of Fish and Game stocked the lakes as an experiment to see how the fish would do, and if all went well, provide more fishing variety and opportunity for anglers.
There isn't a whole lot of angler use right now. We're getting calls, and you know, we've been doing it for a while, and people are starting to catch on that they're down here. You have to want to get here. You don't quite stumble onto them.
This awkward contraption is called a trap net. It was set last evening to catch cutthroat as they fed along the shoreline. The fish hit the leading edge of the net, which is anchored on the beach, and then follow it into a series of baffles. They're directed towards one end of the trap until eventually the whole catch ends up here in the final hoop.
Looks like about 20 fish, which is about what we've been averaging in all these lakes, and the sizes look pretty similar. There isn't a real big hog in here.
Anesthetic is added to the water to calm the fish, and then biologists Dale Allen and reservist Steve Walters get right down to work.
290, 230.
Each fish is measured and weighed, and then a few scales are scraped from the fish into an envelope to be taken back to the lab.
Yeah, we take scales. We can age fish off their scales, kind of like the tree ring concept. They lay down bigger areas of rings during the summer growth period, and then they back off to almost put no rings down in the winter, so you get a change there, you can tell.
In this manner, the biologists can determine if all the age groups they've stocked are still represented in the reservoir, and they can also get an idea of their growth rate over the years. The Lahontan cutthroat are pretty fish, very similar in appearance to their cousin, the West Slope cutthroat.
And then the lake, when they're in the lake, they get these star patterns on the bottom. And well, all cutthroats have the slash mark under their jaw.
Since the trap net tends to catch only the larger fish, a couple of gill nets have also been placed in the reservoir. This type of setup will net fish of all sizes, allowing the scientists to check for various age classes.
Oh, real pleased with what we're seeing. We're seeing all, well, what we call the year classes of fish, all the years of stockings we've put in here. There's fish up to, I think in this lake we saw fish up to 17 inches, and lake we did the other day we saw fish up just under 20 inches. So they're doing pretty well. You know, they're very pretty fish.
Although the Lahontan cutthroat seems to have adapted well to these desert reservoirs, it has a difficult time reproducing naturally. They struggle tenaciously up tiny rocky streams like this to lay their eggs in the spring. But soon, most of these creeks will trickle out and disappear, and the eggs, and often the adult spawners, are left high and dry. So to keep the fishery going, the reservoirs must be stocked. The eggs come from the state of Washington and are raised to fingerlings in the Nampa hatchery.
2 guys in a truck for a day in early June each year. So, you know, pretty inexpensive program for us.
Volunteers like Fish and Game reservist Steve Walters also play an important role in keeping down costs.
Yeah, we use the volunteers and especially our reservists out of, Steve's out of Mountain Home here. There's quite a group and most of them are airmen. They put in a lot of time, they really enjoy it, and we get the extra hands that we need.
It's a good deal. You get to do a lot of stuff, and I think you get a lot back from it, personally.
Steve takes a break from catching multiple fish in a trap net to trying to catch just one on a fly rod. It's a peaceful setting, and for those who crave the quiet of the desert, it can be a whole new fishing experience. In 1906, President Teddy Roosevelt, an avid hunter and naturalist, signed into law an executive order to establish the National Wildlife Refuge System. With the stroke of a pen, he set into motion the world's largest network of lands set aside for the benefit of wildlife. In our next story, we'll introduce you to Gray's Lake, a national wildlife refuge in eastern Idaho that's truly a waterfowl wonderland.
Gray's Lake is a real jewel and a unique piece of habitat that needs to be protected. It is so productive and so unique in terms of its size. It has tremendous potential to produce wildlife, and that in and of itself is a real good reason for protecting it and giving it special attention.
This huge marshland has been protected as a national wildlife refuge since 1965. It's part of a system of over 400 refuges nationwide, 6 of which you'll find right here in Idaho.
I think we'll find a lot here at Gray's Lake. It's certainly an area where you aren't overrun with people, you don't have a lot of problems with crowds, you can be by yourself. You have to face some tough weather such as we're dealing with today.
The weather is typical for a high mountain valley that is typically unpredictable. Nestled in the Caribou Range of the Northern Rockies, Gray's Lake sits at an elevation of 6,400 feet. This means long winters and sluggish springs. Today, the marsh is veiled in a slow-moving mass of dark gray clouds that produces gentle, intermittent rains. The rain has no effect on the primary residents of Gray's Lake. From ducks and geese to stately shorebirds, the marsh is alive with waterfowl. Almost 200 different species of birds can be found in the refuge at one time or another. This colorful character is called an eared grebe, named for the golden tufts fanning out behind the eye. This distinctive plumage only appears during the spring breeding season. Nearby, a white-faced ibis uses its long, curved bill to probe for crustaceans, insects, and small fish, making its way delicately through the rushes. A spat breaks out between two male coots over the favors of a nearby female. Eventually, the challenger is driven off in a flurry of feathers. Cruising high above it all is a northern harrier, sometimes called a marsh hawk, searching for prey. A pair of Canada geese flies off, honking boisterously and disturbing the stillness of the marsh. In the tall grasses, a small blackbird perches confidently on a slender stalk that seems too delicate to bear even the minuscule weight of the bird. A mix of trumpeter swans and sandhill cranes share the shoreline. The trumpeters are fighting their way back from near extinction. These swans are probably the offspring of nesting pairs transplanted to the marsh in 1989 and 90. But the cranes are a common sight here. In fact, Gray's Lake holds the distinction of hosting the world's largest nesting concentration of greater sandhill cranes. The cranes are large birds, long-legged and long-necked, with a wingspan stretching to 7 feet. They have a distinctive call that can be heard over a mile away. Spring is a mating season, and for a moment, it looks as though we may be treated to a lively display of the courtship dance. But before it even gets going, the cranes seem to lose interest and drift away. Eventually, they will mate and lay up to 2 eggs on flat nests like this, bringing off a brood that will follow them like small shadows throughout the summer. Finally, in the fall, they'll migrate south to their wintering grounds in New Mexico. The success of the sandhill cranes at Gray's Lake inspired an idea for an experiment to try and preserve its cousin, the whooping crane, from extinction.
In the early to mid-70s, a whooping crane experiment was started, which consisted of bringing eggs in from the wild population of whooping cranes that migrate between Texas and Canada. And the eggs were brought into Gray's Lake from Canada and placed in sandhill crane nests so that the sandhills would act as a foster parent, so to speak, for the whooping cranes.
The idea worked to a certain extent. The sandhills raised the whooping crane young and taught them new migration routes. The thought was that if a natural disaster, such as a hurricane, were to wipe out the tiny wild population of whooping cranes in Texas, these would remain to carry on. Unfortunately, they didn't carry on. That is, the whoopers raised by sandhills never mated with other whooping cranes. In the late 80s, the fostering experiment was discontinued. Today, only 4 whooping cranes raised at Gray's Lake still remain in the population.
And what will happen in terms of the present efforts to come up with another experiment, another approach to managing them is unknown at this time.
Despite the mixed results of the whooping crane experiment, it did provide an opportunity to bring the wonders of Gray's Lake to the attention of the bird-watching public. And more important, it once more reinforced the premise of preservation initiated by President Teddy Roosevelt when he created the National Wildlife Refuge System.
I think that it's absolutely critical that you maintain places like Gray's Lake for wildlife, and that wildlife has something that is done strictly for it. And from that, we both protect that wildlife resource and we learn so much more. And we will learn even more in the future by that approach, I believe.
Thanks for joining us tonight. We'll close our show with a visit to Deer Flat National Wildlife Refuge located near Lake Lowell in southwestern Idaho. Another legacy of Teddy Roosevelt's and a tribute to the far-sighted actions of a conservation pioneer.